where I did SOC Tier 3 analyst, incident response. I was lead threat hunter. I was intelligence lead. Am I missing anything else that you do in your job now? He took my job, but we're not very low, so he knows about it. So yeah, pretty much anything blue team to consulting. I did there. General Dynamics, I started there. SOC Tier 2, and that's where I actually started doing purple teaming engagements. We had a pen test coming up, my sister wanted to look awesome. So he's like, hey, you know, just figure out what the pen testers are doing. I go out and I'm like, hey, they're running this thing called MITRE ATT&CK. So we tested, and our AP doesn't do anything with it. And so we're like, okay, we need an EDR. We went down that rabbit hole, and we started actually building better detections around it. And that's how I got into purple teaming. Before that, I was at Alpha 2, where I was a network engineer. So when we talk about purple teaming, one of the things that we're talking about is the threat intelligence process. What we want to do is we want to understand the target organization. So when we understand the target organization, we start understanding our threats. If I am a K-12 school, you know, I'm the county's school board, like the IT analyst, I really don't care what North Korea is doing to South Korea, right? Like, that's just not in my threat landscape. But maybe I care about Conti ransomware because they've been hitting schools lately or something like that. So that's where we need to understand our organization, what our threats are. From there, we identify an adversary, we gather threat intelligence, we extract the procedures that they run. So TTPs have been lumped together a lot. They're actually drastically different, and that's what we're going to dive into, because people just throw around the word TTPs, but they're not actually communicating at each level. And then you want to analyze and organize, create a plan, emulate the adversary. Once you emulate the adversary, what you're doing is you're checking multiple things. So you can check things such as, do we have detections around the different procedures that were ran? From there, we can also go out and we can say, all right, did our analysts respond to those alerts that were triggered? If we have any detection gaps, we can conduct detection engineering based on those procedures that we've observed in our environment from that. So that's one of the things that we're talking about when we want to get to a procedure level. We're really talking about trying to get down, understand what the adversaries are doing, and validating our controls or building detections to fill in those gaps. Threat intelligence is not piping your IOCs into your SIM. If you say you make actionable intelligence by piping IOCs into your SIM, that is not threat intelligence, and that is an embarrassment to people who actually do intelligence, because it's a very difficult thing to do, and there's a lot of great people who are driving. This is actually probably like classified or reclassified or like private now, because JP2.0 actually got taken down off the military website, but thankfully it's still out on the internet. And what we have to know is, when we're looking at intelligence, this is where the IOCs are, is the data. But we're actually scoping down to where we're trying to get intelligence on an adversary. So we want to understand their operations. We want to understand their procedures. We want to understand who they're targeting. And so, like this says, we're really understanding the threat actors' motives, their targets, and their attack behaviors. Oh, and I told Dave that I was going to sneak in tactical intelligence. And that's how you really make it actionable. So one of the things that we have to understand, though, when we're talking about intelligence, is a threat. Oftentimes I hear people like, oh yeah, we have a threat because we're vulnerable here. Well, that's not actually a threat. A threat is made up of three simple things. And the more you understand this, the better you understand threats. The more you understand the threats, you understand who's coming after your organization and what to prioritize and address. So first off, we have hostile intent. With hostile intent, what we're looking at is, you know, do we have data that the threat actor wants? If we don't have data that the threat actor wants, we don't care about it. All right? The hostile intent could be to make money. It could be just to, you know, deploy a wiper. So we have to think about the hostile intent. And then we have the capability. You know, for a while, ransomware, we weren't doing that great of procedures, that difficult of procedures. But then as they grew into $1 billion industry, their capability really went up. They started developing or procuring 0 days. stuff like that. So the capability is going to go up. That's going to increase the middle part, which is the threat. One thing about hostile intent too, you can actually control this. So if you are doing something that adversaries are targeting and it's not that profitable for your business, guess what? Stop doing that small little business, then the adversaries go away. So that's one thing to consider. And finally, the area that we control most from defenders is the opportunity side. Opportunity is what's out there in our organization. Do we have app blocking enabled? Do we actually patch at our edge? These are areas that we can control and we can limit the opportunity presented to the threat actors. So the more that we understand these different segments, we understand what threats are potentially coming after our organization. And Andy Piazza put together Threat Box, which is a great area to actually look at and try to prioritize the threats that we care about. And as you can see, it goes by intent. So as intent goes up, it gets more important, and as capability goes up, it gets more important. So, if I'm working for a DoD client, maybe I'm worried about China or Russia more than I would, Venezuela, because maybe they don't have as much capability. I mean, maybe they're supported by Russia some, they might have some of those capabilities, but that's a different conversation. We can talk about that later at the after party. So when we talk about intelligence, we need to go and actually understand the timeline of what the kind of the history of intelligence, what it's adapted within the cyber. And the kill chain that kind of came out. Then we went to APT1, pyramid of pain, and now we're kind of where we evolved to MITRE ATT&CK, is where most people are trying to think of intelligence in cyber. If you're not familiar with the cyber kill chain, I definitely recommend familiarizing yourself with it. If you ever want to work in SOC Tier 1, you're probably going to have to understand this and try to categorize it. One of the areas that we're going to focus on, though, is actual actions on objectives. So installation is one area that we can also look at when we're trying to catch stuff. But for the most part, when we're looking at delivery and exploitation, we're kind of relying on our vendors for that. We're going to do our patch cycles. We're going to rely on our AV, EDR vendors, and our email gateways to really focus on there. But when we're looking at, prevention is nice, but detection is a must. So that's where we really want to focus. We're actually trying to do any sort of purple team engagements, emulations, or detection engineering. You really want to focus on these actions on objectives. The other thing to bring up with the cyber kill chain that a lot of people don't know about, from cyber threat intelligence, I highly recommend going out and reading up on the diamond model. What this actually does is, when you dive into cyber threat intelligence, mapping the diamond model at the different stages of the kill chain actually allows you to line up and track adversaries. So you can actually, if you have enough collection, if you're doing enough incident responses, you can see different adversaries, and that's how you get or activity groups and stuff like this. Also, too, don't need to do attribution, don't try to do attribution. It's really probably not worth it. If you want, I can give you some dice and you can roll them and it'll tell you China, or it'll tell you Russia, or it'll just give you random attribution. But if you can go and you can say the Simpsons did it and it changes nothing, don't waste time on attribution, because you just don't need to do it for the most part. APT1 report. So with the APT1 report, what happened here was Mandiant, private defense contractor, actually started doing analysis on an activity group which linked back to China. One of the things that when we look back across history in defense is, we look at, hey, AV caught something, let's remove that malware. Malware is bad, get it out of here. That's not the way though that APT1 report started showing us. We started seeing that there's more than just malware, right? There's actual human operators behind the malware that's taking actions on objectives. The other thing is, when you get down to that human element, they're going to have certain actions. I don't know how many of y'all work in a large organization such as the military, but you're going to have certain approved actions that you can take. You're not going to go out of that scope, otherwise you're going to get reprimanded. Also, too, it takes a long time to get tooling. Sometimes procurement, like in large organizations, it can take 2 years. Like if they want to buy an EDR, it might take them 2 years because they have to vet through everything procurement life cycle. And then training too. So like, you know, the US, a lot of our operators, they might go to SANS or some other training like that. So you're gonna have certain training, you're gonna have manuals. We're starting to get down to the human element that they're actually gonna do procedures that they repeat and catch. And like I said, manuals, the Conti manual is a great example of that. And it's kind of hard to see up here, but like all of these are just slightly different names that they're registering for their emails. So that's just one example of how APT1 is going, and they're just doing something from, you know, a playbook. Also, this is a screenshot from a remote desktop session, which I still don't know how many it actually got, unless they just hacked APT1 back, but that's an interesting conversation to have as well. And then when we look at procedures, though, we actually look at APT1 versus Conti. So this was back in 2011, or no, my bad, 2013, I believe, or 2012. And this is from Conti 2 years ago. What we see is AV doesn't do detections on procedures. AV does detections on malware. And it doesn't even do a good job with in-memory malware. So that's another topic. But when we get down to it, we actually see stuff like net group domain admins. Right? Conti's still running this. This is like a decade difference, and it still works in most organizations because we're not focusing on actually catching procedures. So that's one of the things, the main takeaway is look at procedures, and we have to figure out how to actually catch those. And that's coming down to one of the things that we're at right now. A lot of people are still down here. They want the hash values. I've been asked time and time again, hey, there's a ransomware incident at one of our suppliers. We want that hash of that ransomware so that we can then hunt for it in our environment. Well, guess what? That ransomware group, they're going to generate a new hash every time. If you're trying to catch on hashes, you're not really going to catch anything. Just because they generate so much and so fast, and they're going to be different across all the environments. Don't get me wrong. You should have some sort of IOC pipeline to check your SIM, but like that's all it's good for. It's just doing a check. It's like doing a compliance check. Like let's just make sure we're at least meeting this level. You know? And then same with IP addresses. So it's trivial for an adversary to change their hashes. Like I've seen tools every time they download, it's a new hash. You also have polymorphic malware that's going to change throughout the cycle. IP addresses, it rotates so easy. Oftentimes, you can have an adversary that's just turning up and then burning down a bunch of different IP addresses. Domain names, too, will auto-generate that. And then when we get to network and host artifacts, this is where we're kind of relying too on our actual vendors. So if I'm looking at my network, maybe I have Palo Alto, right? I'm trusting Palo Alto to build out this stuff. For host artifacts, I'm trusting that my EDR or my AV is going to, go after those. But then when we get to tools and TTPs, which this lumps together back in the day from Bianco, that's where an EDR can't necessarily scope down for our environment. Because if they do it, they'll have too many alerts in other environments. So we really just have to go out and actually have to tune this for our environment. So automate all this, trust that vendors are doing this, focus up here. Now when we say TTP, so we just break that out. I want to get down to procedure level. First, we're going to talk about the hashes, and this is just an example of why hashes, for lack of a better word, suck at doing detection. Okay? Like, literally, so David Bianco, who just did the Pyramid of King, all these, over 8 million, were only submitted by one organization. So most of the hashes do not cross different organizations. So you're doing a check for a hash that you're just not going to see elsewhere. And if you get other areas where it's a worm and worms through the world, yeah, that might have the same hash. But day in and day out, you're just not going to see it shared. So this gets us to attack. So we know that David Bianco said, hey, we need to move up from hashes, IPs, and then we need to get up to that TTP level. So then MITRE started working on attack. This is where most current intelligence lies, and there's little issues with it, but I do enjoy it, and I love the attack team. So it was 2 years after the APT1 and the Pyramid of Pain. But one of the issues is it's a one-way function. Oftentimes people say, I want an actionable, or I want to make attack actionable. And it's like, okay, cool, how are you doing that? And they're like, well, you know, we get the navigator and we put colors on it. And it's like, all right, but that's not what attack's really meant for. What attack is meant for is you have procedures and observations. What it's meant for was when people went to do digital forensic incident response, they would then take those observations, they would map it to techniques, such as the sorting hat, and then they could communicate that to other teams. So that's what attack was really meant for, was just a one-way function going from observations to techniques. It's that simple. So don't try to overthink attack when you hear it. This is what it looks like. So you see here we have proc dump with LSAS, so the LSAS is being dumped using proc dump. That's going to be T1003. That's how you use attack. You actually just map what you see to the technique ID, or you get the software, maybe cast the software ID 0002. You also have, you know, exploitation for privilege escalation. So this is how attack is actually meant to be used. So that's what actually making it actionable is. We're going from the observations to attack. We're not trying to take attack and do some magic fairy dust. That's not how it works. But this is the current state that we're in right now, is everyone wants that 100% attack. This past year they did a recent evaluation and all the EDR and AV vendors said they came out and they said we have 100% attack coverage. And you really can't do that because you don't know what the adversary is actually going to do. Yeah, you can run one test for a technique. Okay, cool. But that technique might have, you know, 50 or 100 different procedures for it. What this leads to is we get stuff like this. I call this the checkbox fallacy. So someone will come in, they'll be like, okay, for this technique, we ran 5 different tests. Let's mark it off. Okay, cool, we got coverage on that. But the issue is if you're running 5 different tests and the adversary is using these other 3 procedures for that, you're not going to catch the adversary. So this is the issue, and that's why I say it's a checkbox fallacy, because it looks nice, management likes it, but you're not actually seeing what the adversary does, and you don't actually guarantee any coverage over the adversary's procedures. That brings us to this, where we actually need to break out TTPs, because everyone's just talking about TTPs, oh yeah, we're going to look at constants TTPs. And most of the time when they do that, all they're giving you is they're giving you a technique. So if I say, hey, you're doing a technique of credential dumping LSAS, that doesn't tell you what the actor's actually using. You don't know if your detection capabilities are actually going to be able to detect it. You need to figure out the actual procedure so that then you can test your EDR to validate your detections. If you don't have them, then you can build it. So with tactics, this is like the bottom of the pyramid of TTPs. We really can't make tactics actionable. They're just too broad. So what I kind of equate them to is their buckets. We take techniques and we put them into buckets. Otherwise, the attack navigator, it would just be terrible. It would be a giant blob. And then, like I said before, once we get up to the technique level, this is where most intelligence that we see is being communicated at. But it's just not actionable enough. Like I said before, if I say credential dumping LSAS memory, okay, how do they do it? If I tell you that they're smuggling in, you know, a file via email, okay, how are they doing it? Is it a password protected zip? Is it going to be in an ISO? Is it going to be a link that then gets clicked and then downloaded? There's so many different ways that you can skin the technique. You have to understand how the actual adversaries operate. And this leads us to this fallacy. We get procedure assumption. Since everyone's talking at the technique level, if I come out and I say, hey, the adversary is using process discovery. I know the adversary's TTPs, they're doing process discovery. All right, but how? So what happens if I go and I run this atomic test? If you don't know what atomic red team is, I definitely recommend it. It's a good starting point. By no means does it mean that you have coverage over your adversary, but it's a great starting point to actually start building a base off of. Atomic Red Team is a great tool to have. You can run different procedures for techniques. But if I say the process discovery is what the adversary is doing, and I run get process, okay, maybe I learned on that. But what if the adversary is actually using native API? Well, now I did all my detection engineering and my alerting on get process. It's not valid for the adversary anymore. So this is where I can't say that I just have coverage at the technique level. I have to say that I have coverage at the procedure level, and we need to understand that. The other area that we get to is people go out and say, hey, I want to emulate APT1. They go to MITRE ATT&CK Navigator, and then they'll grab these techniques. And then they'll just run atomic tests. There's multiple issues with this. The atomic tests don't actually test what APT1 did. The other issue is APT1 actually isn't a valid activity group anymore because of the way that it kind of merged. So that's just another thing. I get asked APT1 all the time, but they just don't exist anymore. So know that. And then attack. Like we said, the technique level, the techniques that can hold so many procedures. So don't have an assumption at the technique level that this procedure is ran. You can't do that. And like I said, you can't go down. If someone tells you, hey, the adversary is doing this technique, you can't go down to procedure. You need that procedure level data. And that's where you can actually validate your detection engineering on. So when we really focus on it, we want to get up to here. So people keep saying TTP, TTP, TTP that. Try to actually get, when you're talking to your, moves, that's not good. When you're talking to your incident response team, when you're talking, to management, you want to get up here to procedure level. Are we actually understanding what our adversaries are doing at a procedure level? Can we emulate that in our environment, preferably in production, so that we can actually validate, our production rule set? So that's what we want to focus on, is getting up to the procedures when we actually talk in our environment. We don't want to just be talking about TTPs, we want to talk about procedures, and that's where we want to be at if we're actually operating a good SOC and a good program. What this looks like when we're talking about, we want to understand the procedure level intelligence, we're talking about actually seeing what they ran. So here we see who am I/all, we also see like an IP config. And we can take this, once again, we can put it over there and we can throw it on an attack navigator. That's great. We can take these and map them to the techniques. But if I were to just give you this list, would you ever actually think that they ran who am I/all, or that they ran this exact NS lookup command? Now, you don't want to necessarily do engineering on the exact command. We'll do that a little bit later. But you can't go from that to this. You have to start here when you're doing your intel collection, when you're doing your detection engineering and your validations. Then what this actually helps us do is it helps us focus on the human element. I work with MITRE ATT&CK. I don't know if any of y'all know him. MITRE ATT&CK has a great story about this. There was an adversary who kept typing a command wrong. Like they kept misspelling it because of either like translation or something like that. So they actually wrote a detection rule for when this one command was mistyped a certain way, because the adversary always did. Whether they were copying and pasting from a manual or something, we don't exactly know. But they actually wrote a detection rule, and they'd be like, oh, there they are, there's Fuzzy Kitten again. They're in the environment again. We don't know how they got in, but they keep running that misspelled command. So there's human elements behind this that we need to focus on. They have that certain training that they're going to fall back on. If you're a threat actor, if you're doing ransomware and you just ransom 10 companies, and you ran this, and this, and it worked in all 10, you think you're going to run it in the next company? Probably so, because you've had these built-up habits. I say I haven't counted how many times I've said up here. Hopefully not too many, but that's a habit of mine. We all have habits. So that's one of the areas we want to think about. There's actually a human behind these activity groups or adversaries and threat actors, and they're going to keep doing the procedures that they do. One of the things is they might swap out some procedures. That's fine. If you're actually doing detection engineering at a procedure level, when they swap some of those procedures out, you'll still have those alerts that they'll still trip because of, okay, they run these 10 procedures, but they swap 2 of them out. All right, I still have the other 8 that I can alert on. That's cool. Also, with the Conti playbook example, this is another copy-paste example where they actually copied and pasted it, and they were supposed to actually fill in the actual IP address. But instead, they just copied it from the manual. So, I mean, this is how basic it's getting, that, you know, people are just copying and pasting from manuals, but they're defeating billion-dollar businesses because the businesses don't understand the procedures that the adversary is running. So what does this look like when we actually want to make stuff actionable? So recently there was a 0 day, all right, that Microsoft reported on. That's cool. I'm not going to really catch a 0 day being exploited. That's why it's a 0 day. But we see this activity. We see that MSHTA is going out to a public IP address. That's a simple thing to test. I can actually run a command and see if I can catch that in my environment. So I understand the procedure that the adversary is doing. If they were to use a new 0 day, maybe they would use MSHTA again. I can catch them. You know, we see who am I execution with it being piped out to a text file. I don't know too many system administrators who are going to pipe it out to a text file. They just want to know what they're running as right now. So you have different things like this that you can scope in on when you actually are studying the adversary's procedures. How do you go about actually gathering this though? Well, like we said, reports like that with Microsoft are great. The DFIR report is another great one. Now they're not going to give you like, you know, cozy bear or fancy bear activity, but they give you commodity malware when it's doing what most people should be concerned about. DFIR report is a great example. That's actually where I discovered about the ISO link example. What adversaries are doing now is they're taking a link file, they're packaging it in an ISO, and then when the actual victim mounts the ISO and clicks the link file, it then will execute a malicious DLL. So that's just an example of going out, finding reports, and actually looking for those procedures in those reports. It's kind of hard to find reports that give procedure level, but if you look for it enough, you start picking up on it. The other area to gather this procedure level intelligence to test in your environment is your incidents. Your incidents are some of the best areas to go in and test, because if they got so far, backtrack that incident and then try to detect it earlier. So that's another area that you can look at too. From there, honeypots. How many red teamers do we have in this team here? We got 1 or 2 red teamers. How many blue teamers do we have in here? We got 2 blue teamers? What does everyone else do? How many people are just starting out in cyber? Okay, good. All right, nice. I don't know what like a third of y'all do it. Just gonna assume management. Well, that was blue team. Okay, red teamers though, like I did this talk, some of this parts at like at DEF CON, adversary relations. Red teamers, they'll come up and be like, man, I know a honeypot when I see one. I'm gonna get right out of there. I'm like, all right, but how do you know it's a honeypot? Well, what do you have to do? You have to actually enumerate that honeypot first. And you have to get onto that honeypot. So honeypots are actually a great area because you're going to get some of the initial actions on objectives that that adversary takes. And then you can do detection engineering on that, and now you're catching them at the front of their life cycle. And then also sandboxing. One of the best things that you can do is, you know, when you actually get your like malware samples from your email gateway on that sandboxing, oftentimes they just do like a quick sandboxing. That's an okay area that you can do detection engineering or detection validation on, because you want to check, like, hey, if those emails, if something happens to our email gateway and that email gets through, can we still detect it? So you want to extract those procedures, run them in your environment, make sure you still would detect that if the email were to get through. The other thing though is you can actually take these email samples, you can run them yourself for a longer period of time, and then you'll actually get possibly some more actions. I've actually seen it before. We like threw some samples into a environment in like, we actually threw like a sample into an environment, and like the analyst forgot to like reset sandbox. And then so like an hour or two later, there's actually an operator operating that malware sample, and it has like laterally moved to the other box in that environment. So if you take those email samples and you actually run them in a sandbox for a longer period of time, you might actually get some actions on objectives from that operator. And now you actually, it's someone who's actually targeting you because you pulled it from your email gateway. Alright, so for red team emulation, procedures are crucial for emulating because we want to actually emulate what attackers are doing. Now, one of the issues that we run into is this red team will tell you these aren't really cool procedures that adversaries would actually run. But that's when you need the CTI, whenever you're doing the procedure extractions, like we showed earlier, document where you got that from. It'll help you if you're ever talking to a red teamer, because when they go, the adversary would never do this. That's an advanced adversary, they would never do that. You want to be able to go, well, here's the Microsoft report where they did it. So now please go run this in our environment. So it always helps to actually be able to cite that. But one of the areas that we need to think about is adaptive procedures. So like we said before, there was ISO that was a link that went to run DLL 32. Anyone know of a different way that you can execute a DLL without run DLL 32? RegSBR, okay. Well, there's multiple ways like RegSBR that you can do to execute a DLL. So when you go to your red team, you say, hey, actually adapt the procedure some. You know, if someone's going to use the ISO link method, how else can they execute? Because maybe I'm catching run DLL 32 in an ISO, but I need to think about what other processes I might also need a flag on that the adversary could use, so I want my red team to adapt those procedures. You know, if I'm reading a report and it says, hey, the adversary disabled the defender. What if I don't have the defender? Well, then I need to swap it up. I need to actually say, all right, they disabled CrowdStrike or whatever else it is. And that's where we want to test also variations and try to break detections. If you're doing red team, you know, try to actually get around the blue teamer's detections. If you're doing blue teaming, you want to hand over your detections so that the red team can try to actually bypass them. They can be like, hey, you shouldn't scope into this command within the set because we can just change that command or we can obfuscate. You know, they can actually help you change your detection to make sure that you're not scoping too granular. How taking procedure level intelligence, emulated attack drives detection engineering is this process. So like we said, we get new procedures that the adversary is doing, we're going to bring it around, we'll emulate it in our environment, and then that kicks off detection engineering. We get the direction, then you go out and you do collection of logs, you'll process those logs, and then you'll disseminate it back to the red team because you want to actually validate that your alert works. You want to validate that the SOC can actually respond to it as well. So this is an example of how we can actually go out and take procedures, run a small, you can run a small purple team cycle, or you can run a large purple team cycle. It doesn't matter. Maybe you only have 3 procedures to run. That's fine. Maybe you have a full 20 procedure set. You can also do that. But that's just how you actually make it actionable. And what that looks like is, in this example, we ran a few procedures. I believe this is from Conti. And we mapped it to our alerts. We see that we only had 3 alerts. Well, if someone's actually echoing the user domain, I probably want to flag on that because if my system administrator doesn't know what domain they're on, that's going to be suspect because my system administrator should know what domain they're on. So I can flag on that. You know, net usage is huge. I might be able to flag on that. Net config workstation, run system info. You know, IP config/all, that might be kind of hard, but if Betty and accountings do it, maybe I can flag on it because maybe only help desk should really be doing that from their accounts. So you have different areas that you should focus on here. Where we ran this, we see alerts. Now we can go out and actually build detections around it. One area I often get asked about is, okay, where do I go to actually look for this? Well, if we ran a procedure and we mapped it to a technique, I can now go to MITRE ATT&CK. If we actually look, this is a technique 1059001. So if I've gathered the procedure, mapped it to a technique, I can now actually see what log sources I need to go look for in my SIM or my EDR to start doing detection engineering. So if I were to map to this technique, I know I need to go look at command execution, module load, process creation, and script execution. I know where I need to go focus my efforts to do detection engineering. The other area that I often get asked about is what logs should I have? Well, attack is actually able to show us which log sources are applicable to the most techniques and sub-techniques. So what we see here is command execution is actually applicable to 243 techniques and sub-techniques. So from a visibility standpoint, if I don't have command execution, I'm going to have, you know, drastically lower visibility. If I have it, I'm going to have drastically more visibility across the attack techniques, and then thus I can detect more procedures. One of the other areas I can touch on is detect. If you ever need to actually map out your coverage of your logging, this is a great tool to have. I just like mentioning it because it's a fabulous tool. But by no means should you ever actually interpret this as defense. This is so you take the tech, you type in all your data sets, and then it gives you a nice, you know, GUI to show management, and you get this nice purple coverage and everything. But this is only visibility. By no means should it be skewed as we have coverage over all this. It's like, just because you have visibility doesn't mean that it's going to generate an alert by any means. So that's one thing to consider. When we talk about detection drivers, we have the operational capability. That's just how good is the analyst and the tools that they work with. If the analyst is working with a tool that's hard to work with, for the longest time, CrowdStrike, you couldn't really actually build custom detections in CrowdStrike. They finally changed it, but that's one of those areas where if the tool can't be used by the operator, then you're not going to get great detection engineering from it. You have to have that data collection as well. If you don't have that data to actually review, then you're not going to be able, you know, you can't see anything. So we need that data collection. And finally, a threat understanding. If you don't know about like LawBAS, if you've never heard of LawBAS, I highly recommend checking out the LawBAS project, living off the land, binaries, and scripts. If you don't know that like an actor's using LawBAS or that exists, you're not going to go out and try to find it. You need to have a threat understanding. For the longest time, like when I first got into cyber, you know, it was AV bad, you remove AV. And then at that point in time, like all the threat actors and all the red teamers were just using PowerShell to just rip apart environments because no one was actually looking at PowerShell. So that's understanding the threat. You have to do that. And the way you understand your threats is by doing that procedure level intelligence. So what do we want from a detection engineering standpoint? We need to leverage red team to test, verify, and then augment. So we can actually just do small tests. If we know that the adversary is coming off of win-word and spawning C and B, let's actually replicate that in our environment, validate do we have detections, do we not have detections, and then if we have a detection gap, let's build one. You know, Excel, spawning, run DLL32. These are just basic areas that we can start at if we're just starting off, actualizing intelligence with purple teaming process. The The other area is indicators of attack. So when we're actually trying to catch procedures, we're not catching IOCs, we're not catching hashes, we're not catching IP addresses. I'm going to look for, like in that previous example, I'm going to look for run DLL32 coming off of Excel. That's an indicator of attack. So we really want to focus here instead of IOC. So if you're just starting out, try to communicate this to whoever hires you or whoever you're working with, that you want to focus here and not there. Automate those IOCs. You know, you can purchase, or there's plenty of free stuff out there now, where you can just go and you can grab some IOC feeds, you can throw them in your sim, they'll do the automated check, boom, call it a day, and then focus on the actual indicators of attack. That's where you want to spend most of your time if you're on the blue team. So with monitoring and response, I have a lot of words up on this slide. I'm not going to turn around and read them to you. You have to validate this though. So I've seen before where actually there was Mimikatz on a domain controller. What you have to know about Mimikatz is it's a credential dumper. A domain controller is probably one of the most critical pieces one of the most critical servers in an environment. So Mimikatz credential dumper is on a domain controller. You can get all the passwords, everything, you know, and you get an AV alert. Analyst says, hey, AV removed Mimikatz from the domain controller, and then they close the case. If you don't know why people are laughing right now, it's because of how the heck did the adversary get to the domain controller and then bring in this tool. So we have to validate our response. Validate responses as much as you can, because you don't want to be, you know, the monitoring team who tier 1, you know, closes the alert and you have a threat actor in your environment for maybe a year, and then eventually, you know, you get a letter from like a 3-letter agency that tells you that you have Cozy Bear in your environment or something. This is just something that I put up. I know I'm not trying to sell anything. This is one of my guys I work with, George. He's a SANS instructor. Him and a couple other people. They wrote this. It's the Purple Team Exercise Framework. So if you actually want to make stuff actionable, like we've talked about, this is a great framework to actually deep dive into it, and you can actually implement it with any framework. I will tell you this: do what works for your organization. When George wrote this, and this is free, when George wrote this, he was at Citibank. Citibank has like hackers like across the world. They're like everywhere. They have a whole team, like 40 plus. And so he wrote this for a huge organization. You know, a lot of us don't have the funding that Citibank has. So adapt with any sort of framework, adapt to your environment. That way, you know, just take the pieces that work, and then you can do it that way. With that, that's the end. Happy procedure level purple teaming. I hope you learned that, you know, we need to get down to procedure level. We don't need to communicate at TTP. What does that mean? We don't know. Is it a tactic that you're talking about? Is it a procedure? Is it a technique? We don't know. So we want to get down to that procedure level, and then I'll open it up for any questions. All right. What?
So, are there any vendors or anyone that's sharing this stuff out that does a good job of getting it to procedure level that we could, you know, take to our management as examples, or that we should be looking for? That's kind of a nice thing to look at, you know.
There's really no one who's giving out procedure level feeds. And then one of the things that you get with that is people also, they price fix, so they're trying to compare IOC feeds to procedure feeds. So there's really no actual good feed yet. We're trying to develop one. That's Jake's responsibility. Anything else? Yeah, what's up, man?
Yeah, so I know you're not trying to sell anything, but what site do we do to like deal with all of this? Like what benefits should we get out of buying the site?
I'm not here to try to vendor pitch anything.
No.
But what ideally what any sort of purple team engagement does is you go out, you understand the adversary, you extract the procedure level intelligence. So if we go here, we're going to extract procedure level intelligence. We're going to develop, we're going to analyze that. We're going to then build an emulation attack and then be deployed. Once you run that attack, you then can do all sorts of stuff such as validating alerts. Missed alerts, like we said, will drive detection engineering. And then after you've done those two steps, then you can come back, you can rerun your emulation, and you can verify response so that you're not mimicast the main controller guy.
Yeah. No, I wasn't trying to get you to sell that. We already bought it, so.
Oh, we're already
bought it, so we're already customers. I'm just wondering what you guys have to do.
Yeah, what's up?
Hey, so how would we go about leveraging frontline responders like tier 1 analysts to be able to add to this type of information gathering? You mentioned that your own incidents are probably one of the most important or impactful ways to gather this type of information. What is the type of information that you want them to be able to record? What is the key thing that they need to collect so that we can add that into this work?
Right. Well, one of the issues is that you're going to run into is your tier 1 operators will not be proficient enough probably in digital forensics or incident response. But what you will be looking at is, if you can, you're going to want them to extract different procedures that they see within that cycle. So when they actually see phishing come through and they're analyzing the event, all right, what did what? And this is where you get into like the diamond model. So you want to map to the diamond model. There's actually a decent tool out there that does this, but with the diamond model, what you're looking at is you're trying to align software and activity. So like with the example with Excel spawning